Okay, guys, so now that we've done the snare EQ, let's move on and I'll show you how I do the snare retriggering. It's basically the same way I went about doing the kick drum retriggering, but in this case, I am not going to duplicate the track and just insert the plugin trigger program directly on the snare track and change the blend. You can see right here on the inserts, I have the trigger plugin located right here. I'm going to instantiate it right now. Control-Command, clicking on it, activates the plugin. And here we have the Slate Digital trigger program that I use. Going to select, let's see, a preset that I have with some snares that are already loaded in. The first one would be this Black Beauty snare, this Dream snare, and this Hard Hit snare. And I've made a blend of those together. You can also do the same thing. These are just sounds that I have acquired over the years, put them in a separate folder, and I use them time and time again on different songs. Let's go ahead and solo the snare without the trigger. So the snare sounds pretty nice. We do have our processing on it, this CB2 EQ program from Mac TSP that includes a dynamic EQ section that I use often. Also have some room on it. We have an SSL EQ here with a little bit of high end added. So there is some processing on the snare, but let's see if we can improve it some more by adding this trigger. And like I mentioned before, I'm not going to totally replace the snare. I just want to add to it by blending in a trigger. You can see here, I can change the amount of trigger that's blended with the real snare sound. Let's just leave it at 100% for now so we can really hear what the triggers sound like. And again, remember, there is a detail control, acts like a threshold, a retrigger control. Both of these interact with each other to give you the proper trigger. Now remember, that's at 100%. So let's go through the sounds separately and I can show you what they sound like. This is the Black Beauty 14-inch. Here's the Dream snare. And the Hard Hit snare. So those are the three sounds that are blended together. Another very important thing to check is the phase of each sample by clicking this phase button. Because a lot of times, for some reason, they're not in phase with each other or in phase with the original recorded snare. Since we're not going to be using it at 100%, it's very important to check the phase, since it'll be a blend of the original snare and the samples. Let's bring the blend back down, or mix down, to 0 and start adding the trigger in. You can hear how the snare sound got really fat and thick as I added the trigger in. Let's now go through and check the phase between each sample and the original snare. So let's see what happens when I play these and flip the phase button. If it gets thinner, you know it's out of phase, either with the other samples or the original snare drum. So on that Black Beauty snare, I think it's in phase. It didn't change that much. Let's move on to the next sound. So you will hear on that one, it made a dramatic difference in the thickness of the snare. Pushing this phase button in, making it out of phase with the original snare and the other trigger, not a good thing to do. So let's leave that one alone. That one made a slight difference, so going to leave that one alone also. Let's bring the mix control up to 100% and check the phase between the triggers. they are pretty much in phase with each other. I would leave all the phase controls alone. Let's now bring the balance back to, maybe 50%, 40%, and play it and see how it sounds all together with the original snare and the 3 triggers. Let's mute the trigger and hear the snare alone. Snare alone. In. Much fatter. Out. In. Wow. There is an enormous difference in the fatness and the thickness of the snare by adding just 38% of those 3 triggers in with it. And by adding just 38%, you're still preserving the human quality of the snare performance. I want to go now and check the retriggering and threshold response of the triggers and make sure we're catching all of the nuances of his snare performance. Here's a good section to do that. So that sounded pretty good, but let's just zoom in a little and make sure it is catching all of those little ghost notes and rolls down there in that snare performance. Let's bring up the retrigger window. Now that sounded really good, but if you look closely at the retrigger window, it's missing some of his fills. Let's try to bring down the detail control, or threshold as I call it, and see if we can grab some more of those. Let's bring it back up a little. If you noticed, when I brought the detail up, not to catch some of those ghost notes, it really didn't make a big difference because we're only at 38% of the triggers being blended with the real snare. Let's bring this up to 100% and then listen. At 100% mix and the detail moved up, you can hear how it's missing many of his rolls. Now that we've brought the detail down, it's catching all of his fills and ghost notes, but it still sounds like a machine because we have the mix at 100%. Let's now bring the mix back down to what I think we had 38%. Okay, so now that it's back to 38% or 39%, you hear how it sounds human. And since we're only using 39% of the triggers, it doesn't really matter that we're not catching all of his ghost notes, since we're hearing the real snare drum play those. Here it is unsoloed. Going to A-B the whole kit with and without the trigger on the snare. Out. Thinner. In. Much fatter. Out. In. So there you go. You can see how just by adding, a small percentage of trigger to a real snare performance can really fatten it up while preserving the beauty of that human performance so it doesn't sound like a machine. One other thing I want to touch upon also about phase is, let's just check the overhead track. A lot of times, overhead mics can be out of phase with the snare drum track since the mics are pointing down at the snare drum, thus causing the snare to get thin when the overhead tracks are brought in. Well, that really did not make that much of a difference with this setup. But I have come across times where the snare sound really good soloed, really nice and fat, then bringing in the overhead mics, it got thin because they were out of phase. This is something you always want to check when you're getting drum sounds in a mix. So I hope you guys got something out of this segment on snare triggering and the amounts of trigger to be used. Let's move on to the next video.